everyone. For anyone who's just joining us, we just joined as well. Hi everyone. Hi Elle. Hi everyone. We're going to bring in Neurohacker right now because this is not going to be a 2.5 hour live.
Oh, it's going to be a 2.5 hours.
It's going to be short, intense, to the point, man style. It's going to be good.
So let's talk.
We're just waiting for Neurohacker, but this is what we're talking about today. Brain food, nootropics, our favorite company. Arlynd's been using it for years and years, and we're going to be talking about that. So we're still waiting.
And my main desire through this would be to just give people an understanding and educate them on possibly where a lot of us are now. I know the newsletter that went out was titled, do you have a demanding life? Are you mentally exhausted? There's not many of us that are going through the seasons of life right now that we are going through that don't have a different level of fatigue.
On every level.
On every level, and that does start up here. So,
Hey, sorry for the technical difficulties.
Okay, I'll let you guys take it away.
Great. So I'm Dr. Greg Kelly, the product formulator at Neurohacker Collective, and I understand we're going to talk all about the brain today. So
we're going to talk about as much about the brain and how it works that makes sense. Because I think we could have probably a 4 or 5 hour live if we were talking about all things the brain. But yeah, what I want to do with you is I want to just kind of get into the nitty gritty of where we're at and maybe to do things a little bit different. And bear with me here for a second to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Sure.
You're familiar with clickbait?
Yes.
Do you like it?
No, not at all. I'm a very, I want high signal, low noise kind of guy, right? Information.
Exactly. And we can agree on that 100%. What I want to do, instead of having this whole, talk that leads to an obvious solution product, solution, because there's a problem, right? We have a problem that we're trying to find a solution for. So instead of having people, I kind of feel like it's just respecting people that are listening to say, we're not trying to tell a story that builds and builds and builds to saying, and here's a product that's going to help you with that. I would rather look at it and give you an opportunity to maybe talk about your journey,
sure,
why you are where you are, and maybe give people a little bit of an understanding and a foundation of why would I listen to a guy like you? Why do you have my time and attention if I know there's a product on the other side of it?
I lost you for a minute there. It froze up. I don't know if you lost me during that.
That's a little fuzzy, but basically what I was saying
But I caught the gist of it, I think, before you froze.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
okay.
So I'll give like the really fast and dirty of my background. So I was went to an engineering college in Massachusetts in the early 80s, had a Navy ROTC scholarship, so went immediately from college into the U.S. Navy as an officer. And so spent my most of my 20s serving the U.S. Navy. I was the healthy officer. So at the time I was, one of the few that worked out, was very concerned with what I ate, which was definitely atypical in the mid to late 80s. And when I got out, I was, I guess, driven by the one question, what does health look like? And it seemed like in all my different travels, including a master's in nutritional and medical anthropology, the naturopathic profession at the time seemed to really be interested in that question as well. So I ended up in 93 through the mid 90s pursuing a degree in naturopathic medicine. And since then, I've worked in one way or another, in the world of health and performance optimization. So that's really the quick and dirty of my background. Yeah. And what led me to Neurohacker was, I really think today the biohacker community has embraced what the spirit of naturopathy appeared to me to be back in the 90s. And so I think a lot of the most cutting edge work on optimizing performance, no matter what the area, is being done by biohackers and people like yourselves. So Neurohacker being very connected to that was why I ended up here. So
yeah, no, that's awesome, and that makes sense. And I think it's important when we're talking, for people to understand. Not only there's obviously a developer of a product, but somebody's story is always going to be the foundation of why I'm going to listen to you, why I'm going to trust you. And I think that's important for people to have an opportunity to understand. You have a long list that we could go through that on paper says, yeah, you should listen to this guy. He knows what he's talking about, and he's got some valuable things to share. But I wanted to bring the person kind of a little bit more to the forefront of saying, yeah, great credentials, a lot going on up here, but who am I actually talking to, and why should I listen to them? So hopefully that makes sense as a bit of an introduction that's maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, the other thing for me that's important, there's, I spent some of my years in the early 2000s teaching naturopaths, spent quite a bit of time working with doctors to teach them, various elements of health. And I think a big part of what we try to do here at Neurohacker Collective, independent completely of any products, is essentially have interesting conversations around health and how you can optimize it. So I view that as a big part of my role here.
Yeah, which is amazing. And that's part of, a whole category that I'm glad you brought up, because it's something that if people want to dive into more than just what we're talking about today, it's such a wealth of information and of connecting with people that can provide great resources and great information on so many different topics. That comes back to human optimization and performance in all levels, not just in, ABC, but you guys cover so many different things. And I appreciate what you guys do there, because I've always had that as a source that I come back to as kind of what are these guys up to now? What are they talking about now? Because it is always cutting edge. And I think for me, it always comes back to, again, I'm saying this again from what we said in the beginning, it comes back to understanding, who are these people, right? What is their whole deal? What is their mission, and why is it such? And you can't have the path that you have had without essentially having a heart for people and wanting to make a positive change. That's Angi and our heart, our mission, of why we're doing what we're doing, why we're on this conversation, is there's people all around us that are begging for solutions, that are begging for something to get them through something that they're challenged with right now. And that's why, starting off when we said, we have some issues going on right now, obviously. Yeah. And a lot of people feel lost, but they don't know why. They don't really understand all the external factors that might be coming into play. Whether it's, go down a list. I'm hesitating to start naming things, but EMFs to, blood-brain barrier issues to, you go down there's a long list. Maybe I'll just say it that way. There's a long list that will present challenges to going through this season we're going through. And for me, that all starts up here. How is this working, and how clear are we here so that we can move through all of these challenges that, we're kind of in a bit of a new normal. If you want to label it that, it's not normal at all, but people are getting to that point of just saying, I'm just rolling through this season because, first of all, I have to. Mm-hmm. It's strange. It doesn't make sense. It's weird. But you kind of forget how taxing and how challenging that is for just normal cognitive function, to just make decisions that doesn't exhaust you, because you have all these other factors now at play of, this used to be like this. It looks totally different now. How do I navigate through all of the new things to navigate through just to make the simple decision? That's so much more work.
And I think work is a key idea, because like in the most simplified sense, most of what our brain's doing, just like what our cells would be doing, has to do with work, getting things done, and that requires energy. And energy ultimately ends up being the finite or the limiting factor. And then some of the other things that you mentioned, we'll just for now dump them all into the stress category. They, in a sense, act to like deplete that energy resource or make it diverted into those challenges instead of into what we'll definitely call thinking. And so to me, when I think of really ultimately what the brain does, one word, thinking, is what captures it. But to be able to think better, we need to be able to have more energy accessibility in our brain and get it not only into the brain, but then used in the right areas to do the different jobs, because empathy and social cognition require essentially different brain resources than executive function, which is different than focus. So ultimately, I guess if the audience takes away one thing, it would be think about energy. If you do better with brain energy, a lot of good things end up happening.
Yeah, and that's again, make it a big funnel. Everything that I do really comes back to energy and how are we taking energy in, how are we expending energy. And you don't have to be somebody that is, goes all woo-woo on it. You can be on either side of the fence of saying, I'm levitating in the corner doing this, or I'm a guy that's got a lab coat on and diving into it. You end up at a similar point of saying energy is where we're starting and ending, right? So it's a pretty important thing to focus on. And maybe I'll hit this back to you now. One of the things that I love about what you guys have been creating really does funnel back down to exactly that, energy. How is it created? What do we do to input that energy? And then how is it utilized and used when it comes to brain function? Because, I think it possibly was you, and I don't want to maybe put this on you 100%, but having a pyramid of understanding what layers of decision-making and cognitive function are in order of a pyramid layered upon layer, what has to be present for those types of things. And I already saying more than I need to in that. I'll let you take that over, because I think it's just a really good image and understanding of like, why would I need to focus maybe on some supplementation to make things work properly?
But yeah, that pyramid analogy is one I think I started to use about a year and a half ago, teaching a few biohackers that were visiting the office here, and recently talked about with Jim Quick on Quick Brain. But the way I generally think about it, often what you'll see would be images of essentially the brain in the middle, then maybe over here you have attention, and over here you have memory and social cognition. So often these are described almost like they're separate things surrounding the brain when you see a picture of it. And what I find much more useful is the idea of them being in a pyramid shape with certain of these, for lack of a better word, cognitive domains, more of the foundation and other ones higher up. So I think of the most foundational thing is being alert and vigilant. And a huge amount of our brain energy goes into essentially safety and protection. So if you think of even when we're asleep, our ears and our brain are still super busy scanning the environment around us, making sure that we're safe. So that like attention or that like vigilance level is super important. And during the day, the most widely used nootropic substance and the most widely used compound for sports performance is by far caffeine. And that's the one thing caffeine does really well, is that alertness or vigilance. But it doesn't really do much more up the pyramid. So the next level up after that, I think of as the attention domain. So that's your focus and your ability to block out distractions, concentration. Caffeine does a little there. Compounds like, theanine, which is found in green tea, does a bit more. And as you go up the pyramid, at least my story is it requires more energy to get higher up the pyramid. So to me, then the next level up, I would usually describe as the executive functions. So these would be all of the skills you need to be a high performer, whether that's in your job, in the gym, whatever. And so these are like skills that have to do with working memory, which is the ability to both hold information in our brain, but use it at the same time.
Right.
It's something called cognitive flexibility, which is our the simplest way to describe it is the ability to change our mind, which we seem to be like deficient in society in many ways. And then a last one would have to do with being able to avoid things we know that aren't particularly useful for us. So, do the things that we set as goal and not do the things that we know interfere. And then above that, I tend to think of as social cognition. So that's your empathy. It's also your ability to be in tune with your own mental and emotional responses to things. And it's your ability to, what we're doing now, read each other's body language and facial expressions. And so what tends to be the case both in research and in the real world is that we deplete our brain energy often before we can get all the way up the pyramid. And so energy, if we were to say like in general, at the start of your day, you're probably going to have the most brain resources in terms of energy. But after a busy, hectic day, then we've depleted some of that. And so what was definitely the case when I grew up, even with my dad coming home after a busy day in the office, long commutes, is my dad had pretty much exhausted his brain energy that could be available for the social cognition. And if we let him do his own thing and recharge for a bit, we would essentially get a much better version of my dad an hour after he got home. And to me, that has to do with that hierarchy, right? Like he had depleted all the brain energy available and needed to reduce it a little bit before he could re-tap into those higher levels of the pyramid.
Yeah. So that's why I wanted you to touch on that pyramid. I was hoping I was labeling it yours, so I'm glad it was. But I wanted you to touch on it because I want to keep this discussion as digestible as possible. Because I think when you're in the biohacking community and you are, diving in from this research to this research to this research, the language can start getting to a point where you sound like a geek or a nerd that people just kind of like, what? Let's flip the channel because you lost me, right? I think it's important to make sure that you're doing a great job in doing that, by the way, but I want to keep things in the lane of people understanding what are we talking about? That's something that maybe I can relate to. Then what do I do about it? If I have some understanding now, maybe what's going on there, what can I actually do about it? The middle of that pyramid and up, to me, is where most people are at. The middle to the bottom of that pyramid, people are trying to figure out everything on the top of it by focusing on the bottom of it. So caffeine, trying to get through because there's so much fatigue and so much exhaustion, like I said in the beginning, based on how many external factors right now are challenging to just make what used to be a logical pathway to a decision all of a sudden has 14 left turns and 2 right turns and under the bridge here to get to what you used to just go, that made sense. Because there's so many different things from, what's even politically correct or incorrect. What can I say? What shouldn't I say? Who do I not want to offend? And I'm not trying to come down on where people are with that, but it's taxing on the mental side of just being able to have a normal conversation without having to put it through a filter. Who am I speaking to? What shouldn't I say? What lane do I need to stay in here so I don't offend anybody? That all comes back to exhaustion, whether people realize it or not. So what we do when we're exhausted, you go to these different supplements, you go to the things that we used to say, I just need to get through this. I need to be a little sharper here. I need a little boost here. Sleep, obviously, is such a huge one, and we can touch on that in a minute, but sleep is such a huge one that most people in this season right now are struggling with getting what they normally would as proper sleep or what they would be gaining from that restorative, cycle. That is being heavily challenged right now as well.
For sure.
So, that, to me, it makes sense to maybe just, I said I want to not talk like we're losing people, but maybe touch on some of the things that our bodies are starting to lack when there's stressors, and why does that top of the pyramid become more challenging to get to? Is that a fair question to let you go on?
Sure. So I think, in my simple view, a simple story of this, everything is competing for the limited resource, which in this case we'll just call brain energy. And so the more things competing for that, which you described some that are relatively new, right? That these 6 to 8 months ago weren't as much on the table. So all of those things are requiring, it might not be a lot of extra work, but extra work stacked on top of extra work in the face of a limited resource means there's now less of that resource available to do other important jobs. And to me, what it seems to be the case is that things lower on the pyramid are always going to take priority for the energy resources. You know, and so if we've depleted it or only have a certain amount of brain energy available, we're just not going to have the capability to get high up on the pyramid as we would if we had more, or we didn't have so many things vying for that limited pool of resources. And so when I think about it, it's all about the capability to do work. Whether it's like brain work is hard, I think, for us to imagine compared to the physical work of going in a gym and moving some weights. Yeah. But even at a gym, our capability to perform well is probably more predicated on the mental energy we have going into the workout than our physical capability.
Yeah.
So like,
and Greg, yeah. I'm gonna interrupt you because I think this is an interesting thing. I'm sure you're aware of the study that was done with about a 30% capacity bell bar curl with focus.
Yes.
You're from okay. I'm gonna let you talk about that for a minute. I'll fill in the blanks if you missed anything cool with it, but I'm sure you got it.
Sure. So the big picture is they had 3 groups, at least in the study that I'm thinking of. I think it's the same one. They had 3 groups of people. One group, they said, okay, you guys for the next, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks, but my timing might be slightly off. They said, all right, don't do anything. Just, we'll measure your, ability, like your strength now, and we'll measure it at the end. The second group, they said, okay, we're going to, and it was a machine, so it wasn't a dumbbell, and but it would have been roughly equivalent to what you said, about 30% of our max weight. And so they said, okay, we want you for the next 6 weeks to do this, barbell curl exercise motion. But while you do it, you're free to watch this, TV in the background and, have your mind wander wherever. And then the third group, they said, okay, we're going to have you do that same motion, but we want you to really focus on the movement and imagine how the muscle's contracting as you do this. And what they found at the end of that is we'll call it the control group that didn't do any exercise, got a little bit weaker. The group that was doing the barbell curl but not focused essentially stayed about the same. So they didn't lose strength, but they didn't really get stronger. And the group that was focused while doing this really lightweight, I want to say they gained 30% strength. I mean, it was fairly significant. And the way at least I translate that is in this, this setting that was very low weight, the focus was frankly the main thing to produce the result.
Yeah. And that's why I interrupted you and wanted you to just touch on that because, again, what are we talking about? We're in an environment that is constantly draining the battery. And when we are in this environment, and it doesn't matter if we were in this season we're living through right now that's its own challenges, life is not easy, and there's going to always be things that come up that will pull more energy. I think most people would agree. You think you're going to get to that point of like, okay, now I've got everything under control. I'm just going to float through here and I've got my 5-year plan in place and everything's there's always going to be something that comes up, always. When that happens, cognitive function is the first thing that's got to have more energy to get through with the decision making and again, go back to that pyramid. Along those pyramid categories, there's got to be enough energy to make wise decisions to get you through the challenging things that are ahead of you. If you look at that study,
go ahead.
If you look at that study, I love that study because you translate the results of a physical barbell curl and saying the more focus you put on that specific thing, the result is far greater than just, it was more effective. And I agree with you. I think it was just under 30% increase.
Correct.
Without doing anything special other than focusing on what it is you're actually doing and being present. And I'm starting to get tired of people using that and throwing that term, be present, be present. you lose what we're actually talking about when it comes to a focal point and actually going there. You know, meditation is also one of those things that you have so many people now that say, oh yeah, I meditate. And this is something that I do. I am a big fan of, I use the Oura ring here, but I love measuring heart rate variability. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the most fascinating things, to me anyway. I just kind of geek out on it. It's one of the most fascinating things to see heart rate variability attached to meditation, or taking the time to slow down and bring things mentally to a point where there's more focus and more purposeful thought processes. And having something that you can quantify, oh, that actually does something, it's just cool. You know?
Well,
So go ahead.
You mentioned meditation, and it reminded me of a story. So HeartMath, Institute of HeartMath up in Northern California, was one of the first companies I knew of doing heart rate variability anyways, at least in a meaningful way, and trying to bring it more as a biofeedback to the public. Yeah. And so I remember going up there late 90s, early 2000s, and talking to one of their researchers. And at the time, he said the two groups that had surprised him with having uncharacteristically low or poor heart rate variability given their habits were endurance runners that essentially ran at a similar cadence repeatedly, right, and long-term meditators. And the researchers' thought process at the time was that in both cases, they were probably training their nervous system inadvertently to have less range of movement, less plasticity. And kind of the thought with the meditators is, if we hooked up a guru figure and measured their brain waves during meditation, they would be crazy high amplitude waves. They would be literally completely focused on their meditation and creating a really in the zone type of thing. And his thought was that a lot of people that said they were meditating were actually more zoned out than tuned in.
Absolutely.
And that's been my experience, both when I was teaching naturopathic students and in my many years doing coaching of people. So I think it's always important not to just focus on the thing, as if we just do this, we're going to get a good investment. It's usually doing the thing with the focus that we need.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's just a fascinating, again, I love being able to have something that you can talk numbers and science and lose people left and right, and bringing it back to something that's like, oh, there it is. There's a result. It's something that you don't have to have a degree to understand what we're actually talking about. That do this, here's what happens, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
The meditation side, again, going back to where we are in the season we're living through, people use that as a time to just hit the pause button, and you can't fault them for it. But at the same time, are you purposefully and productively getting what you're there for? Probably not when you just check out.
Yeah,
so coming back, go ahead.
It was probably about this time last year, I had a journalist that contacted Neurohacker Collective for an article she was writing. And the premise was that there was some exercise that benefited from being in the zone, and then others for essentially being, tuned out. And she'd interviewed a few people before. I don't know who she, had an opportunity to interview. But when she got to me, I basically said, I don't know of any exercise that doesn't benefit from being tuned in. Like, that would be the commonality in higher performance, no matter the sport or exercise activity we're in. And, then I mentioned to her the same thing in studies of meditators, that the people that get the best results from meditators are not people that are, essentially using it as a pseudo nap. Nothing wrong with that, but the best responses were people whose brains were doing a lot of work while they were meditating.
Yeah. And it makes sense when you break it down. So I'm going to throw a different question at you.
Sure.
We're all in this season together, moving through the challenging new things that we have to move through. What are you doing right now that you would call your most beneficial practices, and then maybe move into, supplementation to some degree? What does that look like for you right now? Because I think when there's new challenges, there's new solutions that can be presented. And if it's not a solution that's found yet, usually somebody like you is searching for what can we do to provide a solution for this challenge. Where are you at right now?
Well, you mentioned sleep earlier, and I think of sleep as the flip side of the coin to thinking. So we'll do much better thinking, and especially in the social cognition and executive function areas, if we're getting quality sleep and enough quality sleep to meet our needs. So I've been a big fan of sleep going back 20 years when it didn't seem like it was popular to talk about, a need for more sleep. All my buddies back, around 2000 were like, sleep's kind of a weakness. Like, less is better.
Yeah.
Like it was almost a sign of toughness. And I was incredibly sleep deprived as, because of the Navy. I was called it port and starboard watch, but there was a good chunk of my time out at sea that I was on 6 hours of watch, 6 hours off, and that just rotated for weeks on end. And you still had to do your job, eat, work out in the 6 hour, gaps that you weren't on watch. So, you'd be lucky if you got 4 hours of sleep a night. And, so I don't have any illusions that I perform at my best if I'm not getting enough sleep. So I think that's, absolutely fundamental. Like if sleep's not being a priority, make it so. If you're having struggles with getting quality sleep despite allowing enough time, that becomes super important to work on. And then I'm a huge fan of setting break reminders. I'm, by personality, one of those guys, if I'm working on something, I can sit down and be laser focused, and 3 hours will have got by and I wouldn't have moved from my chair. So I literally on my phone or computer set a break reminder to get up anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. And it may just be get up, walk around the room for 10 seconds. It may be, do some body weight resistance exercise during that quick break. So maybe 5 super slow push-ups. So that break reminder. And I remember seeing, I think it was a TED Talk, but it was a woman that had been one of the, worked a lot with astronauts in the space program. And she felt it was super important for the astronauts, but for us, to have that change from sitting to standing frequently through the day. So it doesn't have to be long. We don't have to do a standing desk. It's just creating that change. And I think that 2 to 3 times an hour is, for most people, that's a really good target to shoot for. So again, super simple hack, but one I think that adds benefits. And what I'll often do, at least in one of those breaks, is just do a quick walk around the block where I live. So right now I've been out work from home for months and months. So, I used to do it at work, and we have a beautiful rose garden outside Neurohacker. So I'd just go out and walk the garden. I think having that stimulation of nature changes what our brain has to do and actually reduces the energy. So, at least in some of those breaks, if we can either get out and see nature or try to hear nature sounds, those tend to be something that replenishes the brain. So those are a couple things. I'm happy to share more, but I know you must have some that would be great for you to share.
Well, and actually, even what you were just talking about, I'm a huge fan of working with oxygen, but adaptive contrast. And I don't want to go too much on a tangent here on that, but going from high concentration to low concentration, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that. But the end result is, well, maybe to make it a little more clear, restricting oxygen or increasing the amount of oxygen available to you. When you restrict oxygen and have a lower saturation in your body wants to produce nitric oxide. That's a vasodilator, just means it just opens things up. So blood flow and oxygenated blood has an opportunity to move through the system much, much more than it would without that component. When we're talking about the brain, how the brain works, what the brain needs, oxygen is a pretty important thing to get up there. And how do we get it up there? That combination, to me, movement and then playing with oxygen. You can do something like that by holding your breath. Restricting that and seeing how long can I hold my breath if I'm going for a walk. Can I go from this post to this post and holding my breath? Taking down your saturation of oxygen, which then the brain and the body says, hang on, I need to find more oxygen here, pump some nitric oxide in the system to open things up. Then when you actually breathe, it's like the lines are open just to go and take in more oxygen than you would have just going for a normal walk. Nasal breathing is another component of that. And then I use tools specifically that are, there's a couple companies that I really like how they've developed tools that allow you to go through an adaptive contrast, high saturation, low saturation. Movement is
Can I just
key.
pause right there?
Yeah.
So I just want to really hammer home to the audience.
Yeah.
Contrast of virtually anything is going to produce good benefits in the body. Our senses, the receptors on cells, they're all designed to detect changes. So when you think in terms of doing things, to me, an underlying principle always to keep in mind is it's not just the doing. We want to do things in a way that are going to create contrast. So,
yeah, absolutely. And to kind of, tag team it with you, the thing that happens, I still haven't worked with or been with somebody that has gone through, hey, let's stand up and go do something different, that you don't come back ready to continue what you were doing, far more refreshed, far more energized, and fog lifts when you do that. You can take two different paths and say, okay, why did it? Because it was nice to change up the environment. It was nice to go experience something else. It was the break. That's true, but what's actually happening in the brain during that time, right? It's a reset. There's a lot going on up there with stimulus when you take a break from what you're doing here. The other side is kind of what I talked about: circulation, nutrition to the brain, oxygen to the brain, what's actually happening physiologically up there. So those two things produce cognitive function that is far greater than not taking the break. So I think I agree with you 1,000%. Doing that changes your day more than most people will actually realize until you start using that practice and implementing it.
Right. I know, I've had conversations. Like I remember a naturopathic student way back when I was teaching courses at the University of Bridgeport, and she came up to me once after class and said, Dr. Greg, I'm struggling to study. I feel like I have to read the same thing over and over, or I'll be reading a page and be nodding off, and I'm just like, what can I do? And the first question I asked was, well, how much are you sleeping? And she goes, well, I can't really afford to sleep much because of all the studying. And my response was, well, what you're doing isn't studying. You would be better served getting enough sleep and then being more efficient with the time you are budgeting to studying. And that's what you just said reminds me of, right? What I've encountered a lot is, well, no, I'm too busy to take these breaks.
Yeah.
But at least for me, my experience is what you just shared, that quite often in my quick walk around the block, an area I was stuck on, maybe writing a blog post or a long article, will all of a sudden click into place during the walk. And when I get back, I'm able now to progress that article in a way that wouldn't have happened if I just sat there and plugging away.
Yeah, it's to me, it's one of the easiest things as a mental picture. It's the easiest thing that most of us want to do. You want to have something that I can say, painting the fence feels good because you stepped away, you paint a bit, you look at it and go, oh, I'm doing something. When it's doing mental, training work, it's harder to take the step back and look at it a lot of times. But it's so rewarding when you can actually do what we're talking about. When there's a block, take a break, and it really literally feels like walking, moving that block, shifting it, because you're actually doing something physical as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you've done something physical to remove that blockage, and you come back and it's like you've cleaned the house. You've tidied things up, right? Mentally. And now you can continue on and move through what it is you were doing. So here's a question for you. Do you have kids?
Yeah. I don't, no.
Okay.
But I definitely feel for my colleagues that do have young kids at home. It's been a much more challenging time period for them than for me. So. Yeah,
and why I asked that, if you did, there would probably have been a little tear that came down your cheek or something, right? It'd be like, yeah, the sleep side of things. So the greatest role that I have ever been privileged to have is being dad. And I'm so thankful for that opportunity. The biggest challenge that has come from that role change is finding the time to get enough sleep, enough quality sleep, and to continue to do the things that that are in front of me to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge that has been, I would say, not the best results that I've ever had when I put my mind to doing something, because I'm not in control. I'm up quite often with our little boy, and you know, without boring you to death with all the details of it, sleep patterns are disrupted more than I thought they would have been. But the interesting thing, again, going back to being able to measure with something like an Oura ring, is what makes the difference in my sleep, regardless of the interruption, regardless of what happens that's out of my control. How do I still get the best quality sleep when I'm able to be sleeping? And I think what you guys have come up with in the last while, I can't remember how far back now that you've actually produced something that is very helpful for a guy like me. And I know with Angi and my audience, Angi's audience is a lot of women that have kids. And that is something that I would love for you to be able to touch on for somebody in that position, regardless of having kids and what age. We're still living in a season like we talked about before. You don't usually hit your head on the pillow and everything's so great that you're just out and you get this great sleep. There's a lot going on with problem solving and questions that are floating around and concerns that are there. It disrupts sleep. So what can we be doing? And that's, again, I'm going to hand it to you because you'll be able to give a lot of great input.
So the product you mentioned, Quality Night, came out in the end of June. So about 4 or 5 months ago, and we worked on it for close to 2 years because, like, frankly, sleep is really hard, and it's we tried out lots of different versions of formulas to try to come up with one that we felt comfortable with as really making a contribution. And one of the, I think, key things for people to keep in mind with sleep is one of the main reasons for sleep problems would be hyperarousal, is the kind of the more sciencey way to say it. But just think in simple terms, your nervous system and stress response are just too active in that time period leading up to sleep. So it's usually called the forbidden zone of sleep, but in general, because of our body clock, the time period about 3 hours before our normal bedtime is a time that it's usually fairly hard to fall asleep unless we're really sleep deprived. Mm-hmm. And that time period ideally should be one that our whole system's relaxing and calming down and doing the opposite, essentially, of the hyperarousal, the stress response. And so really our focus when we created the product was to address that. Let's do a lot of what I would think of as nutrition that would support a much more calm experience of that forbidden zone of sleep in the evening time period. Because if we do a better job at that, one, it's usually easier to fall asleep because our minds aren't so agitated. But two, we would get more restorative quality from the time we are asleep, even if it's disrupted by kids or other factors. And then the other thing, and this I think is counterintuitive, during sleep, our brain does a ton of work. In some parts of our brain, the biggest surges of energy actually happen in the beginning parts of our sleep. And the reason is everything we've learned during that prior day, all the information basically, our brain's going to decide what to remember and move from short-term to longer-term memory. And it creates these big bursts of energy to move it around our brain, which requires ATP, cellular energy. And then in the later parts of sleep, so like the dreaming sleep, REM sleep, which clusters much more heavily towards the time period just before we wake, that's when our brain does a lot of work with resolving emotional and social things that had transpired that day before and essentially making sense of those. So the more challenged we are in those areas, which, as you said, it's been a really challenging 6-7 months in especially those areas, the more we need that sleep at the end of the evening, that early morning REM sleep to do its work. And so like my story about it is during sleep, our brain's doing a ton of work. And the goal is to do things to allow it to be able to do all those jobs. And if that happens, then we end up getting a much better version of ourselves during the day. And ultimately, that's the test of did you sleep well? is how you
Yeah.
show up that next day
Yeah.
for not only work, but your loved ones. Because if we don't get enough, especially again of that REM sleep, we're usually more irritable, more agitated, less likely to be that really, good version you want to be as a dad.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I'm glad we touched on a couple of the things that I'm going to revisit. Weaknesses, most of us want to try and stay away from what we would consider weakness, and it depends on what your environment was, what your input has been to say what is weakness. In the past, sleep was considered a weakness because you weren't accomplishing things, right? You weren't hammering through things. You weren't just like a machine that you could keep going. And that was celebrated, and in a lot of circles still is. And it's hard to communicate to people that are high performers, chill out. You also need to make sure you take time to allow everything that you just said. You need to give the brain the opportunity to take care of business, because we're resilient. Our brains are an amazing, resilient component of us, but at some point, enough is enough. And what we are, Greg, I said in the beginning of this, we could spend 4 or 5 hours, and I want to try and, contain myself of going in all these different areas, but external factors right now, if I just leave it at that, we're talking about patterns and how to maybe create healthy patterns and do things that allow our systems to go through the cycles that they would love to create a healthy, functioning person. We have so many external factors right now that are challenging that, from, like I mentioned, maybe, just touching on EMFs, to what is causing a breakdown in the cell's ability to do what a cell is supposed to be able to do. Mitochondria function is key, right?
Absolutely.
Having the cell be able to create the amount of energy to do its job. If you're measuring in millivolts, it becomes very interesting of what does a cell need, what can it produce, and what has to happen for healing and beyond just a normal function. It gets really, really interesting in this area of, okay, so our cells need energy. How much energy do they need, and what creates the positive outcome if we're giving it what it needs? That, to me, is the biggest challenge that we're all facing right now, is if there's all these external factors that are they are disrupting what our cells are supposed to be able to do, taking energy from our bodies because it's constantly trying to restore when it has all of this, bombardment of just one thing after the other. It can't get into the cycle that it would like to just restore and create a healthy, functioning being. When we touched on sleep, that's one of the first keys. But how do you now do what you do in formulating and look at, okay, where are we lacking, and why with the disruptions that are there, what can we give our system to allow us to get into that restorative sleep cycle and to increase the energy? I'm kind of throwing you a bit of a softball to talk about a couple different things there without trying to say too much, but
well, I'll give a few nutrients just for people, no matter what, like product aside, they can find these individual things relatively easily. But one of the things an ingredient that overlaps both in the cellular energy role and also in sleep is tryptophan. So tryptophan, to me, is super interesting amino acid for a couple reasons. But one is, most amino acids, if you take tyrosine as an example, we probably get 15 to 20 grams of that in our diet. So, taking a capsule with a couple 100 milligrams, it's going to do something, but it's not that huge contrast we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But tryptophan, average diet, 600 to 900 milligrams. So taking 100 to 200 milligrams can make a big impact on your stores of that amino acid. And tryptophan does a couple main jobs, but one of them is it's the precursor to one of our mood neurohormones, serotonin. Further down the pathway, our darkness hormone, melatonin. But tryptophan can also go in a completely different direction and actually be used to make NAD+, which is, that's probably more than any other single molecule over the last 5 years been the thing most talked about for boosting mitochondrial performance and healthy aging pathways and things like that. So tryptophan is interesting because we don't need a lot of it to do these couple important jobs, and it works in both day and night doing things. And one of the interesting things I saw with tryptophan, and I always like things that study naturalistic things, but it was basically having more tryptophan at breakfast. And again, more wasn't a lot. It was just augmenting, maybe 200 milligrams of tryptophan combined with morning bright light exposure made a huge difference in sleep that night, right? And one of the things that I've seen commonly over the years, people that struggle with sleep focus really heavily on all the things right before sleep. But quite often it's the things we did 12, 14 hours before that in a way are the tipping points to how we'll experience sleep that night.
Right.
So morning tryptophan, having a little bit more of that in our diet, which we can get by being more, even just as conscientious or more conscious of eating something with protein for breakfast early in the day. And then combining that with getting some natural light. Or if the seasons don't accommodate that, light boxes, can be invaluable.
Yeah.
So that would be one. Another thing would be, in general, the entire category of polyphenols. So polyphenols are plant stress compounds basically. They're things that plants tend to make more of when they're stressed. And resveratrol is one of the classic ones, which is widely used in combination with NAD boosting strategies. So what would happen if you had grapes and the environment was more stressful? So it was drier. There was, some kind of a plant pest, like bugs nearby attacking another grape plant, fungus attacking another one. If the sun's really intense, all of those things would cause the grape to have more resveratrol, and it's going to concentrate in essentially the skins and the seeds, because those are the things that will be in most contact with the environment. And it's essentially the plant's adaptation to deal better with stress. Capsaicin, what would give red peppers their really hot taste, is another one of those compounds that chili peppers make in response to the environment. And there's a term, xenohormesis, but basically the idea is that when animals or humans consume these plant stress compounds, it alerts our cells that, hey, the environment for these plants was stressful. That could be forecasting it's going to be a stressful time for us, so we better toughen up to get ready. And so what happens when we consume some of these polyphenol compounds, our mitochondria essentially get tougher. They become able to make more energy. So in a real sense, they become more physically fit. So one of the, I think, if you think naturalistically, our ancestors would have eaten a lot more food that was exposed to tougher conditions than we eat. Most of our foods, frankly, grown in pretty, accommodating conditions for the plant. So it's unlikely, even eating a really good diet, that we're getting quite the variety and quantity of polyphenols that we would need for mitochondria to essentially be tougher.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So let's segue then, because to me it's a good lead into product development. Obviously, that is your wheelhouse. I mean, that's what you do, right? Talk about what you want to talk about. So okay, well, let me give you a couple categories. We've talked about, obviously, the brain. We've talked about sleep a little bit. We touched on longevity and what we're talking about now, right? Cellular function and energy. You guys are doing an extremely good job in all of those areas, in my opinion. So I'm going to just let you choose what category to talk about, and you can talk about all of them or focus on one. I don't really care. I just want you to be able to kind of dive a little bit into it to have people understand, okay, great, we're talking about this topic. What can we do?
Okay, yeah, so let's start with energy and cell energy in mitochondria, because whether it's in our muscle cells, other tissues in the body or the brain, the mitochondria and energy are going to run the gamut. So I think I'm very confident that in all our products, energy is one of our considerations for the choice of ingredients, but none more so than quality of life. So quality of life was designed specifically to very robustly affect everything to do with, like, again, in a simplified sense, food plus the oxygen you mentioned earlier are combined to make energy.
Yeah.
And that happens in cells, but most of it happens in mitochondria. And so that product was designed to make sure all the building blocks nutritionally were in place. It then uses adaptogens, mixes of polyphenols to make sure that we create a tougher and fitter mitochondrial network that now can then take advantage of that extra nutrition to make more energy. And our thought making that was what typically happens, like mitochondrial issues classically give you all of the super hard to pin down things that doctors struggle with.
Yeah.
So, like your malaise and fatigue, brain fog,
yeah.
Things as weird as difficulty swallowing, like things that like our body should literally be doing unconsciously, right? Like it should have that job nailed down. And so when you start to see, especially a couple of these hard to pin down things clustering together, that's almost always a sign that we could use some support for our mitochondria. And so, the thought behind quality of life was that almost anyone will have some Achilles heel where that region of their body, the mitochondria are just underperforming. We almost, I would say probably 80% of symptoms would have that in common.
Yep.
So if all we did was improve the ability to convert food and oxygen into energy, good things tend to happen. And so that was the thought process behind, the need for a product like Quality of Life. And then, then we spent a lot of time trying to understand all the different interacting pathways. Even something like NAD, which gets a lot of attention, the cells have actually 3 completely different ways they make NAD. In biology, it's called degeneracy, but the easy way to think of it is redundancy. For some really important jobs or molecules, there'll be multiple ways to do it because it's that important that you can't rely on only one. So when we created that product, we really wanted to make sure we supported all 3 of those different paths, which at the time was unique. I think it still is. What I see is a lot of ones that tackle one way to make it in crazy high doses.
Yeah, and even just pausing you there for a second. So, looking at complexity science and looking at how, maybe a better way of saying that is, I think what a lot of people are familiar with is exactly what you just said. Here's an ingredient. Here is a pill that is just going to, boom, you're going to give you a bunch of this because that's supposed to be beneficial for your performance, your system, your memory, whatever it is. And to try and say you're going to create a product that's good across the board is very, very challenging, right? Because we're so individual and we are so uniquely challenged depending on one person's cellular structure to the next, right? You can get so detailed in why is it going to be different for you to me. And the thing that I like about what you're doing is what you just explained is what are the ways that we can affect every person in a healthy, beneficial way? Is it going to affect every person to be able to create and give the body what it needs to have more mitochondrial health and production? Absolutely. And it doesn't really matter what we're talking about as a challenge for A, B, or C person. If you have more of that available, what's in front of you is going to be more doable. And that's what you guys are doing very well, in my opinion. And beyond that, actually, here, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I agree. And that even when Neurohacker Collective creates products, we don't. So I guess my model is I think there's going to be super responders to, and exercise is a great example. When one of my deployments, I lifted weights pretty much the entire 6 months with this other guy. We started about the same strength, build. He looked like Superman by the end of those 6 months. I'd maybe gained like 2 pounds, and granted, I was way more sleep deprived and under a lot more stress than him because of our different jobs. But he was your classic super responder to that, where I was a responder, but our results were drastically different. You quite often see there's going to be, for some interventions, non-responders. People that just didn't work for them, right? Like genetics, the history they went through, lots of reasons for that. So when I create products, really my goal is to make sure that we disproportionately get super responders. The vast majority of everyone else responds, and then there's going to be some people that are non-responders, and that's fine. And it's why we do a 100-day money-back guarantee, right? We don't want you to put your hard-won money or hard-earned money and not get a good response. So, so I guess I just want to clarify. Neurohacker Collective does not expect that 100% of people will respond to our products. We frankly expect there'll be a small subset that don't. And we want to make sure that we take as much risk off the table as possible. Yep. And conversely, before we would ever market a product, we've already tested out to make sure there's a high percentage of super responders.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. You're in the position you're in. I'm in my position, and I'm going to say, without having the restrictions you probably have, every person will be positively affected if you're giving our systems what it's requiring to function. Some are visible, some are not visible. It doesn't mean there's not positive change happening. And I think that's where challenges are when people are living in the environment we're living in, saying, I need to take this pill and it's got to change things today, because that's what we're used to with different approaches with pharmaceuticals and different approaches. So
I think, so we haven't talked as much about it, but our original product was Quality of Mind, which is our brain product, for focus, memory, better thinking. And so we all have essentially different struggles with thinking. So my memory has always been, and I'm not going to be modest here, my memory has always been really solid. And my best friend, going back, he was in the Navy, but we've known each other since, early grade school. His memory, literally he's 2 days younger than me, but his memory has always been poor. And so when he took Qualia, 30 days later, I got a text and he's like, wow, this was night and day. My memory, I can't believe the difference. Where for me, I didn't notice any change at all in my memory, but I noticed about 6 weeks into it that I was way more patient in rush hour at the end of the day. That when I was getting together with friends to do, trivia at a bar on a Tuesday night, I was way more tolerant of people than I would normally have been, and more resilient to all the background noise at the bar. And so for me, it really strongly affected that social cognition we talked about earlier. I've met obviously a lot of people that have taken it and focus, things that are very immediate, they take it, they come, recommunicate a half hour to 4 or 5 hours later that, they were, in the zone and focused. So I believe that depending on where our brain is most limited, that's where a good nootropic tends to work the most for us. And if those things are more immediately felt, then you may feel a result that day. For me, with the social cognition, that was a much more gradual type of thing, that all of a sudden it dawned on me wow, I feel like a way better version of myself.
Yeah, and I that's been my experience as well. It's something that using mind in the beginning, it was that day, and for sure in the first week there was a significant recognition that things are working much better. So it's just fun. Obviously, it's having something that you can tangibly say, yep, that's different. So that's great. Going into the different products that you guys create, I think there's a different expectation based on what are we actually trying to achieve. Right. Like something like Eternus, for example, what you guys do for longevity and cellular energy and health. That's not something that is going to have that same punch feeling as mine, because how do you measure that? There's different ways of measuring it. But yeah. So
and Eternity's been renamed as Qualia Life. So that's
right. That's right.
That happened, and so that's when I was referring to. And yeah, that one's like that's what I would say a felt product, but instead of being felt in a day or 5 days, what you usually see is 5 days to 30 days, and it was designed really to be felt more over a month. So things like productivity would be, something that routinely I've got feedback on from people I've worked with that they've noticed when taking that. And it almost seems like why would that be the case? Isn't this for like cell energy? Why am I feeling this? Like what I would think of as a more of a cognitive effect, but again, it's because our brain uses about 20% of our total energy every day.
Right. Yeah. So it's a whole system approach as opposed to targeting one thing that you're going to recognize. Yeah. And that's we're going to wrap things up here to some degree. Why Angi and I go through the process we do to work with people and product and have things in our lives. It obviously goes through a big filter with me. I've been using Qualia for 5 years, I believe it is, something like that. This is the first short little while that we've been talking about it. And the biggest reason we wanted to do something with you guys in this capacity now is we want to continue to put tools in people's hands that we believe are going to benefit whoever has the option and opportunity to have access to that. That's what we are trying to do, is give a little bit of education on, how do our bodies work? What do we need? What happens with our brain? Why are we taxed right now? Obviously, there's a lot of things that are causing some mental fatigue. We touched on sleep. We touched on, to some degree, nutrition. But one of the things that I have found with using your products is it fills in the blanks if I can't. If I'm not covering certain things, I know I can at least fill in, the little potholes that are being created and give my body the best opportunity to keep healthy, to keep functioning at a higher level, even when I'm not creating the best environment that I would want to, with having kids that are waking up at night all the time, with having a schedule that is not me saying, this is the perfect layout for how I'm going to function optimally. I kind of have a safety net to some degree with your products that give me an opportunity to get through and to do the best job that I can. And I definitely notice that. So that's where we want to come on and do something like this with you guys, introduce you and your product, and I would say your heart, to affect people in a positive way. That's what we want to, showcase a little bit and give people the opportunity to look at what you guys are doing and try some of the product that you guys have that does make a difference. You can break down the science of it. I know you guys have a lot of information available. And for anybody that wants to do a deeper dive than we did, or more specific in certain areas, that's available from your side as well. But I highly recommend and encourage people to take this area very, very seriously. If you think about what we're talking about, cellular energy and our brain and cognitive function, it's a pretty important thing to make sure is focused on. And you guys are doing a great job at creating products that is not just pushing product out, it's pushing solutions to people that are living in a world right now that truly needs some help. There's not one of us that is going through this season that doesn't need a little bit of aid to just have things optimally function. And you touched on it a few different times. What areas of that pyramid probably are suffering? And when you go to the empathy, you go to the social interaction, that's huge for right now.
Yeah. And then I think also, maybe more than anything else in executive function is that, cognitive flexibility would be the term for it. But that, again, ability to change our mind. What, unfortunately, and I don't know if it's, because of the internet or, multiple interacting factors, but it just seems like, we get more and more hardened in our side of the story and less able to have that cognitive flexibility. Yeah. And so again, what I don't, my story is that blaming the person for those things is silly. Really, what I would say is those are just a symptom that maybe this person would benefit from their brain working better, from it having more energy. So if, if for me personally, if I'm feeling, my social cognition skills aren't where I would like them to be, or, I'm not able to tap into some of these executive functions in the way that I feel I should, then, my story is that's not my brain's fault. That means I need to do a better job at getting it resources, at getting more restorative sleep, at taking the breaks we talked about earlier that allow the brain energy to kind of recharge during the day. Yeah. And so ultimately, I think the key message that that I always try to put out is that it's if someone's struggling in those areas, you're not the problem, right? It's not that you're not doing the right things. It's that your brain probably needs something that it's just not getting enough of.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. My great-grandmother actually said something that has stuck with me through my grandmother, through my mother, that the person that is giving you a hard time always has a why behind it. What's going on with them? Where is there something happening there that their response, their actions are based on something? And you're talking about an area that is very worth looking at. When we aren't covering what our brains need with sleep, with nutrition, with things there's going to be lack of function, which usually means behavior, decision making that isn't optimal.
Right.
And it's a different version of looking at maybe what my great-grandmother was saying, but it comes back to the same principle of there's a why behind everything. And if we can control some of the things that give us the ability to limit things going off the rails, then why wouldn't you do that? And to perform your best and to live this life the best you can, if there's ways that we can do that, and products that can help, and tools that can help, and practices that can help, why wouldn't you do that when we have one life to live? Yeah. How can we go through this life the best way we can absolutely do that? So I just want to thank you, Greg, for the time and going through the questions that we kind of threw at you to some degree, explanations that you've given, and I think did a really good job. But big picture, just what you guys are doing, what you're producing. But again, what I always come back to is the heart behind it, because affecting people is my heart, and affecting them in a positive way and giving people tools and education to hopefully give them the best path to living this life the best that they can. So thanks for doing your part in that. Thanks for what you guys are doing there. And thanks for partnering with us in this season of life that we can put tools in people's hands. And I know you guys are, you're doing free shipping right now, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll put that on after this, so people understand what they can do. But thanks again for this time. Thanks for everything that you've shared.
Sure. It's been a privilege. Like it's always, at least for me, a wonderful opportunity to just have a cool chat with someone that is as knowledgeable and as caring as you are. So keep up the wonderful work.
Thank you. Appreciate that as well. Well, hopefully we can do something like this again, and if there's more specific topic that we can dive into at some point, that'd be cool too. And
I'd love that.
Yeah, but appreciate it. Hope you guys are having a great day down there, and we will catch up with you hopefully soon.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks. All right.